Hello friends, this is Vision Overseas. We are providing both online and offline coaching with most repeated and authentic practice material. Once you join our coaching, you will be updated with latest practice material for next quarter. If you have any question or query, you can visit our website thevisionoverseas.com, and even you can contact us on given WhatsApp number for more details. Thank you.
For the first time, Japanese researchers have conducted a real-life experiment that shows how some traffic jams appear for no apparent reason. They placed the 22 vehicles on a single track and asked the drivers to cruise around at a constant speed of 30 kilometers an hour. At first, traffic moved smoothly, but soon the distance between cars started to vary, and vehicles clumped together at one point on the track, but the jam spread backward around the track like a shockwave at a rate of about 20 kilometers an hour. Real-life jams move backward at about the same speed.
Well, in 2004 we integrated ticketing in southeast Queensland, so we introduced a paper ticket that allowed you to travel across all the three modes in southeast Queensland, so bus, train and ferry. And the second stage of integrated ticketing is the introduction of a smart card. And the smart card will enable people to store value, so to put value on the card and then to use the card for travelling around the system.
The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may be discern the true interests of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose.
Lawrence Stephen Lowry RBS Raw was an English artist. Many of his drawings and paintings depict Pendlebury, Lancashire, where he lived and worked for more than 40 years, and also Salford and its surrounding areas. Lowry is famous for painting scenes of life in the industrial districts of northwest England in the mid-20th century. He developed a distinctive style of painting and is best known for his city landscapes peopled with human figures often referred to as Matchstick Man. He painted mysterious unpopulated landscapes, brooding portraits and the unpublished Naranet works, which were only found after his death.
Interesting sound. I would have guessed a Wild West performer was practicing with a bullwhip while also vacuuming. But no, that sound is apparently produced by the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. Since 2000, researchers at Finland's Aalto University have been collecting audio as part of what's called the Auroral Acoustics Project. Folk tales had long held that the lights also produce odd sounds, but the claims were hard to prove. And some researchers thought that any noises produced by the energetic particles that cause the light show would be far too high in the sky to be heard on the ground. but the latest results indicate that at least some sounds are produced very close to the ground. A setup of 3 ground-based microphones allowed researchers to estimate that the sounds occur perhaps just 70 meters up. The results were just presented at the International Congress on Sound and Vibration in Vilnius, Lithuania. More information about the sounds of the Northern Lights could lead to a more complete understanding of the phenomenon. So if you see an aurora, keep your ears open.
Perhaps you've seen pictures of the large array of, those radio telescopes in New Mexico, scanning the skies for intelligent life in the movie Contact. Well, radiant astronomers have cause to celebrate. The first phase of a giant new radio telescope array went operational in Northern California. It's going to help astronomers study things like black holes and dark galaxies. All the while scanning the stars for, who knows, radio signals coming from somewhere else in the universe. Maybe E.T. is phoning home.
Without getting into the details of exactly how that happened or how she got it out, let's just say it was a bad situation. And she panicked because, like for many of us, her phone is one of the most used and essential tools in her life. But on the other hand, she had no idea how to fix it because it's a completely mysterious black box. So think about it. What would you do? What do you really understand about how your phone works? What are you willing to test or fix? For most people, the answer is nothing. In fact, one survey found that almost 80% of smartphone users in this country have never even replaced their phone batteries, and 25% didn't even know this was possible.
Candace Galen is based at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And, being a biologist, she thought, why not use this astronomical phenomenon to study a biological one? Specifically, as the skies darkened, would daytime pollinators, like bumblebees and honeybees, call it quits? What better activity during an eclipse than to go out with a recorder and record the bees? So Galen asked 400 citizen scientists, including young students, to place audio recorders in 16 flower patches along the path of totality, in Oregon, Idaho and Missouri. When they analyzed the audio, they found that during partial eclipse, bee buzzing continued. But when totality hit, the bees went silent and only the conversational buzz of human observers could be heard. Then, as the moon passed and the sun again lit up the sky, the bees regained their buzz. Social harm originates out of a series of debates within criminology about the narrowness of the definition of crime, that essentially focuses on individual acts of harm, things like interpersonal violence, theft, so on and so forth. So the idea of social harm originally was to expand that notion of harm to encompass the harms that organizations cause, that nation-states cause. But latterly the idea of social harm really now transcends criminology, so there are a group of writers who think that, and I would include myself there, that actually there's something to social harm that could be very useful in terms of trying to understand the harms that occur within society, to produce an objective and well-rounded analysis of harm.
There are some 250 million cars in America, 250 million cars in a country with just over 300 million people. And most of those vehicles, of course, are gas-powered. This poses a huge challenge given the limited supplies of oil and the growing urgency of the global warming crisis. But there's good news, according to our guests today, and that is we have the know-how and the technology to build sleek, fast automobiles that don't use gasoline. These vehicles of tomorrow are powered by hydrogen, electricity, biofuels, and digital technology, and they already exist. So what's stopping us from putting them on the roads? Our guest today will help answer that.
Postmodernism is, broadly speaking, a reaction against the movement or the period, or perhaps simply the values and beliefs of modernism. Most people, even those who seem to know what it is or was about, tend to define it in negative terms by telling us what it isn't or doesn't do. Initially, the term had a fairly limited application and referred to a new anti-modernist style of architecture. But it spread like a virus to include almost all aspects of contemporary culture. One thing we can be sure about is that it wanted to get rid of what were called the grand narratives by which we explained how the world and history got us from the past to the present. Another feature of postmodernism is its belief that truth and reality are human-centered and internal. That is, the primary source of truth in the present age is the self. This, I believe, has now all passed and been thrown in the rubbish bin of history. Yet it is difficult to know whether the age of information technology confirms the passing of postmodernism or is a consequence of it.
As a consumer, you're probably consuming imports. If we have a trade war and we start slapping tariffs on all of those imports, the bill is going to be higher. If the world relies so much on trade, what is a trade war and why do countries get caught up in them in the first place?
Last year, astronomers observed two neutron stars collide. A crash transmitted in gravitational waves to detectors here on Earth. Represented in sound, you can hear a small upwards sweep in frequency, in the data, if you listen closely. Several seconds later, the first waves of electromagnetic radiation arrived here on Earth, the first time a collision has been detected by both light and gravitational waves. And it's in studying the electromagnetic echoes of the collision that astrophysicists have gotten a far better glimpse of what really happened after those binary neutron stars merged, 130 million light-years away. Oh yeah, absolutely, so it gives us an understanding of basically all the nitty-gritty of what's going on after the merger takes place. Kunal Mooley, an astrophysicist at Caltech. First, he says, the stars collided, creating a massive, black hole-like object, which started sucking up the cloud of neutron-rich cosmic debris left over from the crash. But its appetite was limited. It cannot eat all of it, so some bit of it basically escaped. Those escaping leftovers spewed outward into space, as a powerful jet. But along the way, Mooley says, the jet appears to have interacted with that cloud of neutron-rich material, blowing up a sort of cocoon within the debris floating around the collision. Until finally, the jet burst out and slammed into interstellar space, releasing yet more radiation we could detect here on Earth.
To figure out these counterintuitive findings, the researchers conducted an experiment in a hotel room. They rounded up some lizards, gave them a perch, and used a leaf blower to mimic the effects of high winds. They set up a net to catch any lizards that lost their grip. As the artificial wind blew, the lizards moved so the perch took most of the airflow. But their hind legs would stick out, and if those rear limbs stuck out too far, they acted as sails. Eventually those back legs were blown off the perch, and the lizards were just holding on with their front two legs. And they could only hold on like that for so long as the wind speed increased further and further, until eventually they were blown off the perch and into the nets. So shorter back legs gave a survival advantage. A trait that might be passed on to the next lizard generation.
Crows, she says, are what's known as partial migrants. Every year, some members of the population migrate between breeding grounds and their overwintering grounds like parking lots. But others just stay put. So Townsend and her colleagues wanted to know if that urge to migrate was something individual crows can turn on and off. To find out, they captured 18 crows from overwintering spots in California and New York. They fitted the birds with little backpack satellite tags, and tracked them for several years. Overall, 3/4 of the birds migrated, an average of 300 miles. And more importantly, if they migrated once, they did it every year, suggesting traveling is not a habit they switch on and off. The researchers also found that migrating crows returned faithfully to the same breeding grounds every year but were more flexible on where to overwinter. Which could be a good thing.
Interesting sound. I would have guessed a Wild West performer was practicing with a bullwhip while also vacuuming. But no. That sound is apparently produced by the aurora borealis, the northern lights. Since 2000, researchers at Finland's Aalto University have been collecting audio, as part of what's called the Auroral Acoustics Project. Folk tales have long held that the lights also produce odd sounds, but the claims were hard to prove. And some researchers thought that any noises produced by the energetic particles that cause the light show would be far too high in the sky to be heard on the ground. But the latest results indicate that at least some sounds are produced very close to the ground. A setup of 3 ground-based microphones allowed researchers to estimate that the sounds occur perhaps just 70 meters up. The results were just presented at the International Congress on Sound and Vibration in Vilnius, Lithuania. More information about the sounds of the Northern Lights could lead to a more complete understanding of the phenomenon. So if you see an aurora, keep your ears open.
The way I look back in the past is by using the fossilized remains of deep-water corals. You can see an image of one of these corals behind me. It was collected from close to Antarctica, thousands of meters below the sea, so, very different than the kinds of corals you may have been lucky enough to see if you've had a tropical holiday. So I'm hoping that this talk will give you a 4-dimensional view of the ocean. 2 dimensions, such as this beautiful 2-dimensional image of the sea surface temperature. This was taken using satellite, so it's got a tremendous spatial resolution. The overall features are extremely easy to understand. The equatorial regions are warm because there's more sunlight. The polar regions are cold because there's less sunlight. And that allows big ice caps to build upon Antarctica and up in the northern hemisphere.
Green chemistry is a concept designed to develop technologies which allow chemistry to be practiced with minimal damage to the environment, or in an environmentally compatible way, and it's meant to cover both chemical processes and chemical products. The center was set up about 7 or 8 years ago. And the idea was to provide a hub of activities that covered fundamental research work, international collaboration, but also educational development on public understanding of the project as well, and also networking, so we network out to well over 1,000 people around the globe.
Signs that secured borrowing remains robust and firm data on manufacturing and retail sales, released on Thursday, painted the picture of an economy that has yet to be cooled by the recent spate of interest rate rises.
Experimental psychological research is conducted in a lab under controlled conditions and attempts to rely solely on an application of research methods to understand behavior and mental processes. As an example of a psychological experiment, you might want to investigate people's perceptions of different tones. Specifically, you could ask the following question: is it easier for people to discriminate one pair of tones from another depending on their frequency? To answer this, you would want to disprove the hypothesis that all tones are easy to discriminate.
Scientists filming in one of the world's deepest ocean trenches have found groups of highly sociable snailfish swarming out of their bait nearly 5 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. This is the first time cameras have been sent to this depth. Although some species of snailfish live in the shallow water, the Hadal snailfish are found exclusively below 6,000 meters. Here they have to contend with total darkness, near freezing temperatures, and immense water pressure, equivalent to 1,600 elephants standing on the roof of a mini-car. They feed on thousands of tiny shrimp-like creatures that scavenge the carcasses of dead fish reaching the ocean floor.
Obviously, this is all relevant to your final assignment. So we're going to talk about it. So until today, we've gone through face-to-face interviews as the main sort of part of interviewing the window. Today we're going to have a look at going to use an email and why they work, why they don't necessarily work, and what are the challenges and some of the things that we need to be understanding, when we are completing such interpreters. So let's start with the 4-in-1. Obviously, there are a few benefits to them, and they are listed there up on that slide. It's obviously less stressful for those of you who might be a little bit anxious about interviewing.
Again, I want to repeat that I don't blame libertarians for this state of affairs. My argument is really that they simply have nothing to offer us in this debate. When we talk about trying to get rid of the welfare policies that have enabled some of the breakdowns of the family, that is undoubtedly important, but I think we're beyond that at this point. The damage is so deep. And it's kind of hard for me to envision a future without Social Security, for instance. I quite agree with the analysis that the Social Security, Medicare and that sort of thing, have decreased the primary functions of the family, but I cannot imagine a world in which we get rid of these things so that we will be. From a pragmatic point of view, we have to think about what we can do to try to bolster up this breakdown that I keep referring to.
Now, the Earth naturally removes CO2 from the air by seawater, soils, plants and even rocks. And although engineers and scientists are doing the invaluable work to accelerate these natural processes, it simply won't be enough. The good news is, we have more. Thanks to human ingenuity, we have the technology today to remove CO2 out of the air using a chemically manufactured approach. I like to think of this as a synthetic forest. There are two basic approaches to growing or building such a forest. One is using CO2-grabbing chemicals dissolved in water. Another is using solid materials with CO2-grabbing chemicals. No matter which approach you choose, they basically look the same.
When you look at a lake, you are looking at a collection of molecules that have been there on average for about a decade. In the ocean, the residence time is thought to be more like 100 years. Altogether, about 60% of water molecules in a rainfall are returned to the atmosphere within a day or two. Once evaporated, they spend no more than a week or so, Drury says 12 days, in the sky before falling again as rain. Evaporation is a swift process, as you can easily gauge by the fate of a puddle on a summer's day. Even something as large as the Mediterranean would dry out in 1,000 years if it were not continually replenished.
Social harm originates out of a series of debates within criminology about the narrowness of the definition of crime, which essentially focuses on individual acts of harm, things like interpersonal violence, theft, so on and so forth. So the idea of social harm originally was to expand that notion of harm to encompass the harms that organizations cause that nation-states cause. But latterly the idea of social harm really now transcends criminology, so there are a group of writers who think that, and I would include myself there, that actually there's something to social harm that could be very useful in terms of trying to understand the harms that occur within society, to produce an objective and well-rounded analysis of harm.
In that month or 6 weeks, the patient may feel perfectly well. He may even travel around the world spending hours packed into crowded airplanes with unsuspecting fellow passengers. That's bad enough with regular TB or with strains that are resistant to 2 or 3 mainline drugs used to treat the disease. But it's a potential public health catastrophe with the new strain called XDR-TB, for extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. The strain is impervious to a wide array of first- and second-line drugs. That's why 30% or more of its victims die. And that's why people like Lawrence Gustine are rethinking what public health authorities should do about people with suspected XDR-TB in the weeks before the diagnosis is in.
Now, as you know already, there will be a midterm exam next week. The exam will be an open book, open note, and open internet resource exam. But you can't use a classmate or me during the exam. Many of the questions on this exam don't have definitive answers. I wish to assess your critical thinking ability and your ability to combine ideas. A poorly organized answer will not get the same grades as a well-organized answer. Here are some good ways to study for the exam. First of all, it would be better for you to organize and review your lecture notes. That means you many need to compile notes and lab test results if you have not done that already. I strongly suggest that you write trial outlines before the exam. I think it will make you feel more comfortable. Just stop by my office. Those of you who've never heard the term Neo-Latin, may be forgiven for thinking it's a new South American dance craze. If you're puzzled when I tell you it has something to do with the language of Romans, take heart. Over the years many classes who have confessed they are not really sure what it is either. Some have assumed that they are so-called late Latin, written at the end of the Roman Empire. Others have supposed it must have something to do with the Middle Ages. Or perhaps it's that pseudo-Latin which my 5- and 7-year-old boys seem to have gleaned from the Harry Potter books, useful for spells and curses that they zip one another with makeshift paper ash ones. No, in fact, Neo-Latin is more or less the same as the Latin that was written in the ancient world, Classical Latin. So, what's so new about it?
For the first time, Japanese researchers have conducted a real-life experiment that shows how some traffic jams appear for no apparent reason. They placed the 22 vehicles on a single track, and asked the drivers to cruise around at a constant speed of 30 kilometers an hour. At first, traffic moved smoothly, but soon, the distance between cars started to vary and vehicles clumped together at one point on the track, but the jam spread backward around the track, like a shockwave at a rate of about 20 kilometers an hour. Real-life jams move backward at about the same speed.